So far, the only mode of inputs and outputs we have talked about in Python are with the user via the terminal, right? So you give a prompt to the user and you get something in response. Well, what if there was a file, an actual file on your computer? So a very different program. Let's call it inputs.txt, and it contains the following information. It has the string hello in the first line, and then it has world in the next line, and then an exclamation point in the third line. So this is a file, very simple. It's made of 3 lines here, and I want to be able to use a Python program to get the contents of this file and basically read them up, use them, utilize them, print them out to the user maybe, but there should be a way to have a connection. There should be a way to have a connection between a file on your computer and a Python program. So let's say this is Python. And this whole idea of opening a file on your computer and reading information from it, or opening a new file on your computer and writing information to it, basically comes under the umbrella of file IO. So file input, output, IO. And this connection is basically going to be a file object. Remember, everything in Python is sort of an object, so we're going to be using a file object to sort of have this connection between my program that I write and any file that is on my computer. So think of it this way. Let's say that I have a file I have in my main namespace. I defined a file object, right? We'll go over in a little bit how we go about doing that, but let's say I define a file object, and this here is our memory. So if I tell Python to make a file object and read the contents of this file in particular, inputs.txt, what's going to happen is there's going to be like a connection made. Because what Python will do, it'll ask your computer to load this entire file in memory. So let's say it makes like a copy of this. So it's a copy of inputs.txt, and it will be loaded into memory. So Python isn't actually going to access this originally, like wherever in the folder it is, but it'll ask your computer to say, okay, can you make a copy of inputs.txt and just load it up in memory so I can point to it? Just like we point to like other objects. And so this is where your file object basically resides, right? This is where it's in memory. So whenever you open a file to read or to write, basically a connection will be made in memory, and that's sort of how you're going to be grabbing the information or writing the information. So you can go either ways. You can either write information or you can read the information, right? Okay, so we now know for certain that to make a file object, you probably need the name of the file, right? You need the name of the file that you want to open. So let's say to open a file object in Python, you need one, name of the file. That's a given. And then 2, you want to also specify the mode you want to open it in. Do you want to write contents to it? So do you want to write to file? Let's say you want to write a bunch of variables, their values into a file. Then that's a different mode compared to reading from file. If you only want to read contents from this file, if you want to read hello world and the exclamation point, then you're going to use the read mode compared to the write mode if you want to open a file and write stuff to it using Python. So in that case, you also specify the mode. So R for read mode, W for write mode. Okay? And so let's look at what the code will sort of look like. So I'm going to make a file object. I'm going to call it my file. And I will say open. That's a function that we haven't looked at before, but open basically opens a connection, a file object connection. And I will pass in a file name followed by the mode. So that's basically the structure here to open a file. So let me rewrite this with an actual example. I'm going to say open our example, the inputs.txt, in quotation. So you've got to pass the file name as a string with the extension. The extension is really, really important. So in your file explorer or finder, when you look at files like this, they only might show up as inputs. It'll just look like this, right? Something like this. But there is a hidden extension right next to it. So you got to pass the actual extension too. Otherwise, Python will think that inputs without an extension is another file, and that's just going to cause confusion. And then the mode, also in quotations, let's say read mode, which means that I've opened input.txt, loaded up in memory, and I want to read the contents from it. Once you open a file in this read mode, you cannot use it to write information to it. And similarly, if you open a file in write mode, you cannot read the contents from it. And so if I want to print the information out, from my file, I can do something like this. I can do my file dot read lines and store it in a variable here. Now, what the readLines method does, the readLines, there is a readLine method that will give you the very first line, but I recommend you use the readLines method. And what this will do is that, so let's write it here. So the dot readLines method, this guy returns a list of all lines in the file object. And so if you saw that inputs.txt currently has hello in one line, world in the next, and then exclamation point, that means that file list, when this code is executed, will look like this. So every line is a separate string. So even if your file had numbers, they will all be converted to string, just like the input function. And every line will be a separate element in this list. And so now I can basically go ahead and say for I in file list, print I. And that would very simply just print hello, world, in quotation mark. Right? Fairly simple. Because now we're just printing the elements of a list. Now, one more important piece of information that you need to know is that here I have actually opened a connection, right? I opened the connection using a file object with a given name and some mode. And then I use the contents and stored them in a list. Whenever you're done with, playing with a file in Python, I really recommend that you go ahead and close that connection. So you'll use myfile.close method here. And if you go back, here's what we had, right? Whenever I open a file object, I basically make a connection here. I really want to cancel that connection out afterwards, because this file still currently exists on my computer. So I don't really want to corrupt it, right? If it's still being loaded in memory, it might get corrupted by other programs. So I really want to, after I'm done with like reading a file or writing to a file, I should always close my connection. So never forget to never forget to close your file connections when you're done. let's also look at an example of writing to a file, and it's fairly simple, I'd say. So let's call it outFile, my file object, and we'll use the main function again. And now I should be able to say something like a new file name. So let's give it a file name new.txt. And we're going to do write mode. Now, say on your computer right now in this folder, wherever your code is running, there currently exists a new.txt file. What's going to happen when you open it in write mode, Python will erase the current content. So let's say new.txt currently had like ABC written in it. When you open this connection, and remember the whole thing in memory happening where there's arrows being pointed out to this thing loaded in memory. When you open this connection, Python will erase the contents of this file if it exists. If this file does not exist already, Python will create a new file. So this was your directory. Python will create a new file called new.txt, and you can just work on it, where you can add information to it. So if you're opening with write mode and the file already exists, all of its contents are going to get erased. If it does not exist, then Python will just create a new file for you to write information in. So you have to be wary about what you're trying to do. Okay, so let's say I want to, let's say for the time being, this file does not exist, right? So let's say in my directory, there is no new.txt. So what I can then do is after I've opened it, I want to write information to it. So let's do for I in, let's just write a bunch of numbers in there. Range of 5. Let's write the numbers 0 through 5 in that file. And then you can do print I. Right now, if you run this code, let's also remember to close after this for loop. So let's do outFile.close. Always close your file connections. Right now, when I run this code, it's going to open new.txt. So it's going to open new file. And then it's going to print to the terminal numbers 0 through 4. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? That's sort of the idea of this for loop here. And then it's going to close that connection. So once this program runs, you're going to have new.txt, but it's going to be empty. So how do you write to it? Well, you say comma, and then you pass a very special parameter for the print function. We haven't looked at it before, but you can say file is equals to something. And you're going to basically pass the name of the file object that is open with a write mode. So always remember that. So I'm going to say outFile. And let's close that parentheses. So here's what's going to happen when you run this piece of code. It's going to open a file called new.txt in write mode, so I am able to actually write information to it. And then for I in the range of 5, which means 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, I will take on all of these values. Print I, not to the terminal, but to this file. So it's going to print 0 to that file. And then you're going to go back to the for loop, and I will carry on. You're going to have 1, 2, 3, and 4. After this for loop stops executing, you're going to close this connection. And so you're going to end up with new.txt with these 5 numbers actually written in it. So very similar to the read mode, you're going to be reading information line by line. And so here, you're going to be writing information using the print method line by line too. And it sort of all works out. But the main idea is still there. You have to open connection. I'm going to say via file object. And then you run your input output operations, whatever you want to do. So in this case, we output a bunch of numbers. And then lastly, you want to always close your connection. We're going to look at a lot more examples in class about file I/O and even some exceptions we might need to handle to make it work perfectly. Let's try out some file operations in Atom here, and I'm going to start by making our file object. Right, so let's first write some content. So let me rephrase this. Let's say ask the user for 3 numbers and add them to a file, and let's call that file user numbers.txt. Right, let's try that. Okay, so I'm going to first start by opening the connection, so using the open method, and we already are given the name of the file, so I'm going to call it user numbers.txt, and then the mode, and I was told to add something to a file, so I'm going to open it in the write mode. And right away, I really suggest you just do this. You, at the very end, just do a file object.close, so you don't forget to close it. And we're going to write our main code over here. So I have to ask the user for 3 numbers and then add all those to a file. So let's try this mechanism. Let's try to do this in a loop. So for I in range of 3, so this will run 3 times, 0, 1, 2. I'm going to ask the user for a number. And so I'll say that user number is going to be the input, and I'll say enter a number. And let's also convert it into integers right away. Okay. And then I'm going to say print user number for the time being. So if I were to comment these pieces of code out for the time being and run this program, let's do 5, 6, let's do 5, and let's do 3. So you'll notice that it prints them out one by one. But now, instead of printing to terminal, I want to print to this file object. So I will do comma file equals file object. So this parameter you're saying this parameter file, and you're giving it the value file object. So you're passing this to the print function as a parameter here. And you'll notice that if I run this code again, it already created users number.txt. So when I said open users number.txt, it right away created a connection. There's nothing in it right now. You'll notice there's nothing in it. But now we can add stuff while we're running this program. Let's say the number's 6. You'll notice that it also did not print to terminal. And then if I go back to the file again, it is still empty. And that's a really important thing to note. Let's add the number 5. I'll check the file again. It is still empty. There should be 6 and 5 over here, right? But that's not the case. And then I'll also do 3. I'll check back user numbers, and now it is showing the information. So this sort of fortifies the notion of the connection and the file object in memory where things are connected. So if you're adding stuff to a file, only until you close it will it actually go through to your computer, and it'll say, okay, take this stuff that I've changed in memory and actually push it to the actual file that you're storing in your computer. So you have to close your file object to solidify that you're actually making changes with write mode. So don't forget this part. Okay, so it was very easy to just, write this information out, but let's try to now let's try to read it back in. And so for this, I'm going to remove all of this code, and I'm going to say that this will be in read mode. So now what I want to do is I want to read users number.txt and store all this information and find the sum of all these numbers. That sounds like a really good example to try out. So I've changed it to read mode, and let's try this. If I run this code right now, nothing's going to happen. But imagine what would happen if I did something like this. This is not a syntax error, right? It could potentially be a file name, but when Python runs this line, it'll say, hey, does user nums.txt exist? And it doesn't, so it should throw you an error, a file not found error. So let's cater to that. Let's try this. Let's try to do this. And let's do accept. And let's say file not found. And then we can just basically add file name provided is incorrect. And let's also just make it a little more modular. Instead, we could just say that I'm going to pass you the file name. I'm going to make a variable. It's just going to be a string. And instead of hard coding the string name, I will just say the variable name. And let's also move this guy inside the try block. Right? It doesn't make sense that you're making a file object inside the try. If that fails, then the file object.close function will also error out. Okay, so let's try this again. And now it'll say file name provided is incorrect. Awesome. So let's try the file name, and it should run successfully, right? So it tried to run these 2 lines of code and it was successful. So it actually went ahead and executed them. And now I want to do something here. I want to read through this file and first print out all the information there is. So let's try this. Let's do numbers list is going to be file object dot read lines. That's the method we'll use. And I'll also print numbers list. All right, 6, 5, and 3. And remember, every single line that you read in Python is going to be from a file, is always going to be a string. So just like the input method, and it will also have this new line character. That's what makes it 6 new line, which means like the enter. So new line 5, new line 3, and then another new line here. So you're going to have to like remove all of this before you can parse this information. You have to always remove this new line from every single line you get. Okay. Now, one thing to note, if I were to take this file object.close and put it over here, so open the file name, close it, and then try to read the lines, you're going to have a value error. So let's also cater for that. Let's do accept value error. And it basically says you're running an operation on a closed file, so don't close file. And let's just do file already closed. So just to test it out, it'll give you that error, and let's try to fix that over here. And it should work perfectly. Okay, so I have a numbers list, which is basically the list of all the lines in my file, and I want to convert them all to integers, and I want to sum them up. Okay, so in that case, what I'll do is let's make a new list, right? Let's make a new list. Let's call it integer list. And then for I in numbers list, so for I in all of these, let's show you what the print will look like. 653, and the extra space again is because of this new line character. And so if you want to remove these, if you want to remove that new line or the tab or anything, you can use the strip method. That works on a string. So I is currently a string, and what the strip method will do is it'll remove the white spaces and all this new line character that might be on the either ends of your string. So now it'll print things nicely, right? It looks nicer here. And now instead of printing it, I will say that make it integer first, right? And then instead of printing, I will say make it part of integer list. So integer list.append the int version of 6, the int version of 5, the int version of 3. You won't see anything happen, but now I can say print sum of integer list and also print the actual integer list that we found. So it's the list of numbers 6, 5, and 3, and their sum is 14. You'll notice that I ran these two lines after I closed the file object, but that's because I've already filled integer list and some integer list already, right? I don't really need this. I could even put file object.close over here. That's when I have read the information, so I don't really need this object to be open. And if I run this now, it's still going to give me the same result. So here I am closing the connection, and here I am opening the connection. And between the opening and the closing, you want to do all the relevant piece of information of storing the information or the data from your file. So here I'm storing the file contents into a list. And so if I've already done that, if I've already read the information from a list, then I can just close the connection. I don't need that anymore. And this whole mechanism is me, you know, finding the sum of the numbers in the file. All right. So there are plenty of ways to, you know, do this piece of code. You can, you know, make it into a tuple. You can just add an integer and add some to it. Have a running sum in the for loop. But the main idea is still there. You can only do that. You can only read information from a file if you're opening it in read mode. And you can only write information to a file if you're using the write mode. But just always remember to have a connection open, do the task you need to do, and then always close the connection. Number list is just a list in your program, so you can use it afterwards. But after you close this, your file object, the contents of the file, the actual connection in memory are going to be lost. So make sure you have them and at the right spots. Also, make sure to have this in a try block, because sometimes, let's say you were asking here for the user's input for the file name, right? So you had something like file name is going to be, enter the file name to read. And that's great. But the user might be able to make mistakes with extension. Always remember the extensions. And the user might make a mistake. So let's say if I run this code and I give you test.txt, you'll notice that it doesn't really exist here. It's gonna be helpful to have this except block here. And so if you run it again and actually give it the actual file name, it works. And remember, just to show you that giving the extension is important, I'm just going to give it user numbers, and that's not correct. Python really wants you to give the file name as well as the extension here.